Hello strangers and story lovers, and welcome to my lair. Please don't even ask what I'm supposed to be dressed as today. I just kind of went with vibes. Although considering, the title of the video and, the background, can you guess? Today we're talking about Vicious, the first book in the villain saga by VE Schwab. What was this? What right does this book have being this good? Do you know that feeling, when you're starting a new book and you still have to kind of fall in love with the stories and the characters? You just don't know the characters so well, so for a while you're not super hyped and you kind of have to force yourself to get into it, really. And then you get into it, it's just like the first couple of pages, sometimes the first couple of chapters, you just kind of need to just fall in love with it. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, non-existent here. I was sucked in straight away. First page, bam, instant interest. It's so intriguing straight away. Very mysterious in a non-forced way. It's not like one of those books where you have characters kind of artificially telling you there's a mystery, I've changed so much since that day. Don't you wonder what happened that fateful day? Keep reading, and you might find out, page 350. None of this here. This book is subtle. Well, in that way, at least. As subtle as two people in a cemetery digging up for a corpse can be. But I'm getting ahead of myself again, so let's do this properly. As per the now usual, I will just have a spoiler-free section at the beginning where I will just share my general thoughts on the book without spoiling everything. And then we will move on to the spoiler zone where I will spoil everything. But fear not, I will let you know when you need to jump off to avoid any spoiler and just spoil yourself the joy that is this book. Victor and Ellie started out as college roommates. Brilliant, arrogant, lonely boys who recognized the same ambition in each other. A shared interest in adrenaline, near-death experiences, and seemingly supernatural events reveals an intriguing possibility. That under the right conditions, someone could develop extraordinary abilities. But when their thesis moves from the academic to the experimental, things go horribly wrong. 10 years later, Victor breaks out of prison, determined to catch up with his old friend, now foe, aided by a young girl with a stunning ability. Meanwhile, Ellie is on a mission to eradicate every other superpowered person that he can find. Aside from his sidekick, an enigmatic woman with an unbreakable will, armed with terrible power on both sides, driven by the memory of betrayal and loss, the arch-nemesis have set a course for revenge, but who will be left alive at the end? So this is a whole book about friends to enemies. How did I not read that before? And it's extremely well written too. This is just incredibly overwhelming. I don't know how to cope. Let's just start with the positives. First positive is the characters and their dynamics. Instant like on the characters. They're so compelling. 70% of these characters are certified terrible people, and part of the fun of the book, to me at least, was to try and identify who was the worst one so I would know who to root for. So of course my allegiance first went to Victor because he's our main first POV character. And so naturally just gotta support your boy, don't you? But it becomes very clear very fast that where he considered he's been wronged at some point or another, he may have had it coming. Just a little bit. And don't get me wrong, it's not like at some point I started trusting Ellie, but at some point my loyalty did start wavering a little bit. Just maybe actually Ellie is not the worst one out of the two? I don't know. Hard to tell. I felt a bit like I was voting for a politician at the end of the day, like who out of these guys is gonna burn the world the slowest. And of course I'm not gonna reveal who I think is the worst one of the two here. That's for spoiler zone. But I found it was just fun to keep guessing and just kind of trying dancing around to see which one it was and just completely, constantly reshift your judgment. I loved reading about their relationship and their dynamic and how messed up it was, especially at the beginning. There's just so much love, admiration, and jealousy between the two of them. You see that they seem to like each other genuinely, but it was never this perfect bond that was broken. You can tell very early on that they were always a bit messed up, the both of them. And I just love it for some reason. Sydney and Mitch were an absolute pleasure, of course. Probably the only characters of the book that aren't complete trash, to be honest. Not as in terrible, obviously, just as in they're not terrible human beings. Because, don't get me wrong, I do love Victor, he's brilliant, but he's not exactly what I would call a decent person. Where I think Sydney and Mitch are, and it's refreshing. I loved Sydney and Victor's relationship. I just lack the words to express exactly how much I wanted Victor to adopt her as his little sister. It's just so sweet how much she trusts him and how much she seems to think he's a good person despite how oddly straightforward he is with her. There's a very cute moment where Victor is about to go do something messed up and Sydney wants to come with him and he's just like, nah, you think I'm a good person and I don't really want to prove you wrong. No, Sydney, he said. I need you to stay here. Why? She asked. Because you don't think I'm a bad person, he said. And I don't want to prove you wrong. And I squealed. I did. I'm weak. Second thing that I really liked about the book was the mystery. The mystery behind what exactly happened between all of those characters was just so compelling from the very beginning. I just could not put the book down. I just wanted to know what happened. I just really felt this urge to keep reading. And it just felt like my life was an obstacle keeping me from reading. It was so nice. I'm usually not a fan of non-linear structures in books. I find that it can often feel a little artificial. And I thought here it was a bit risky because, especially at the beginning, the past was just so much more interesting than the present, just because there's so much more happening. It's very mysterious. You want to know what led to the current situation, basically. So it could have been very easy to just read the past and be like, this is where the story is. Why isn't the book about this? Why do we have to endure the present moments? Because, especially at the beginning, where not much happens in the present, the past is where the good stuff is. That's where you learn how the fallout between Victor and Ellie happened, which is, the most mysterious part of the story. But even with the present here, I just never really felt bored. It was just a good pace all along. And I think I'll have a video a bit later on why I think that is, so I'm not gonna go too deep into it now. But yeah, I think the flashback and the different timelines in this book work really well and they don't step on each other. And every part, every era is interesting in its own right, and I was personally never bored. And when things suddenly start making sense and every piece fall into place and you can see what's going on exactly, it's just so satisfying. And at first I was thinking, this mystery is just so compelling, the past is just so compelling, but once the truth is revealed, is it still going to be this interesting, or is the rest going to fall a bit flat? But of course, no, it doesn't. It doesn't fall flat at all. Things start picking up even more after that. You get the payoff of everything that was introduced, of all the tension and everything, and it's gorgeous. And like I said before, I think there's a subtlety to how the mystery is built. It's not too in your face, it feels very natural. The characters don't tease you with, what happened that day? They just have normal conversation, considering the abnormal events that happened to them, about what happened, and it's just enough that you can pick up that you're missing information, but it doesn't feel artificial. It feels like just a conversation that normal people would have. So you're just left intrigued by what got them in those really weird situations where you have friends who would want to kill one another. The two looked like ghosts as they wove through the graveyard, both blonde and fair enough to pass for siblings, or perhaps father and daughter. They were neither, but the resemblance certainly came in handy since Victor couldn't very well tell people he'd picked up the girl on the side of the rain-soaked road a few days before. So, yeah, tell me that's not intriguing. This has got to be one of the best written books I've read in a while. The style is gorgeous, but it's not too in your face. It's just in the service of the characters, the plot and emotions, which is really what I like. It knows when to take its time and when to get a little bit faster. There were periods of time where I didn't even notice the style, and then some other times where it would just slap me in the face with one of the most beautiful sentences I've read in a while, which is exactly what I want in a book. Sometimes I want to focus on the emotions, and sometimes I want to focus on the action, and sometimes I just want to be sucked in by how beautifully something is written, and the beautiful sentences are always where they need to be to enhance a strong moment. And you have some also really cool phrasing that just really help highlighting a character's thoughts or way of being. He took one last breath and said a quiet curse, which was as close as Victor came to praying. Come on, tell me that's not cool. Now let's talk about the negatives. I'm sorry, what's a negative? Can I eat it? And now that we're done with the spoiler-free zone, we are starting the spoiler zone. If you want to read this book and avoid spoilers, now's your chance to leave. Before you go, though, please click the like button if you've enjoyed the video so far. Subscribe if you want to see more of my face. Go read the book, have a blessed time, and then come back and see if we agree. And with that, I consider all of the non-spoiler people gone, so let's spoil. So the story starts with two of our main characters, Victor and Sydney, in a cemetery digging up a corpse. Because that's how you start a book. And they just kind of casually talk about this guy called Ellie that they want to scare and send a message to, and it's all very intriguing. Always a strong start. Now, before we go further into the story and all of the details of the twists and turns and everything, I will remind you that the story and the structure is non-linear, meaning if you read, you will switch in between past and present, which I will not do for my own sanity of mind. So I'll just start by catching you up on everything that happened in the past before the cemetery scene, and then we'll just go with the present linear style. Sounds good? Sounds good. So, 10 years ago, Victor and Ellie were university students in the University of Auckland. Science students, to be precise, and they were about to start working on their thesis. And Ellie shocks everyone with the subject that he picks for his thesis, EOs, short for extraordinaries, aka people with superpowers. And they're just kind of a rumor, urban legend in this world. So not everyone believes they even exist, but yet that's what Ellie wants to do his thesis on. Victor is very intrigued by the process, even though at first he doesn't seem to be taking it very seriously. He doesn't seem like he believes that EOs are a thing. But then the more Ellie gets into his research, the more Victor gets kind of sucked into it as well. Because you see he's a bit jealous of his friend Ellie, and so he gets kind of scared that Ellie will discover something major and just completely leave Victor behind. So at some point he just really wants to be a part of it front and center. So when Ellie suggests that EOs might be the result of a near-death experience, Victor, who is a little bit messed up, says, "Oh my god, what if we almost killed ourselves? That would be an awesome science thing, wouldn't it?" And Ellie, who is even more messed up, says, "Oh my god, yeah, let's do it, you start." So they do that, and Victor has a first botched attempt where he survives, but because Ellie called the hospital too quickly, he didn't really have a near-death experience, so he doesn't develop powers. But then they refine the process, and Ellie attempts his own near-death experience, and hence he becomes a Neo. And his superpower is that he literally cannot die. He will heal from any wound. And I love this whole moment because these guys are just completely messed up. They don't really seem to care if they die in the process or if the other one dies in the process. It's like, it's for science, you know, and science comes first. There is a scene where Victor gets very panicky when Ellie nearly dies. But yeah, it always just reads really odd. There's a lot of disregard for what they're doing and how crazy it is. But yeah, it's just really odd to read. And that's when I first realized that I was in terrible, terrible hands with this book. Awful people, those two. But it was just so intriguing and fascinating to read. They both seem much more fascinated by the experiment than scared by their friend potentially dying. Yeah, that scene where Victor has to save Ellie and he does start actually panicking. But it's after a long time of him just being kinda chill. He'd chosen to wait a few more minutes though, which is why he'd poured the drink. If Ellie did manage to come back from this, he wouldn't be able to accuse Victor of rushing. When it became evident that the body in the bath wouldn't somehow revive on its own, Victor set the drink aside and got to work. But yeah, Ellie does come back with powers, and so Victor feels left out. He's very jealous that Ellie got powers and he didn't, and he's basically scared at this point that he's just gonna become nothing more than Ellie's sidekick. "Give yourself time to recover, okay?" said Ellie. "And then we'll talk about trying again." There was nothing overly wrong with the words, but Victor didn't like the way he said them. The same calm, cautious tone people use when they want to let someone down slowly, smoothing a no into a not right now. And you can tell that there's just a lot of jealousy between them. Also because Victor fancies Ellie's girlfriend, Angie, but also because of the whole science thing. Anyway, Victor wants to have the whole near-death experience again, but Ellie says no. He needs to recover from his own failed attempt first. So Victor tries to do it again on his own by giving himself an overdose at a party. But Ellie comes to the rescue. Which was actually one of the rare moments where I felt like Ellie was acting like a normal human being. Yes, please do stop your friend while he tries to take his own life to get superpowers. Once the cocaine was in its lines, 7 of them, he pulled $1 from his wallet and rolled it in a narrow straw. As seen on TV, he looked in the mirror. You want to live, he told his reflection. His reflection looked unconvinced. You need to live through this, he said. You need to. And then he took a breath and bent over the first line. An arm came out of nowhere, wrapped around his throat, and slammed him back into the wall opposite the vanity. Victor caught his balance and straightened in time to see Ellie run his hand through a several $100 worth of coke, brushing it all into the sink. What the fuck? Victor hissed, lunging for it. He wasn't fast enough. Ellie's coke-dusted palm shoved him back again, pinned him to the wall, leaving a white print on the front of his black shirt. What the fuck? Parroted Ellie with shocking calm. What the fuck? You weren't supposed to be here. You come at a party. People notice. Ellis texted me when you showed up, and then Max texts and tells me that you're buying out the coke. I'm not an idiot. What were you thinking? His free hand grabbed the cell on the sink. He read the text. He made a sound like a laugh, but his fingers tightened around Victor's collar, as his other hand pitched the phone into the shower, where it broke into several pieces on impact. What if I hadn't heard my phone? He let go of him. What then? Then I'd be dead, said Victor with faint calm. But of course, Victor decides to try again, this time with the assistance of Angie, Ellie's girlfriend, and Victor's crush, who I thought was surprisingly easy to convince. If one of my friends told me they needed my help to try and get a near-death experience so they would get superpowers, I'd like to think I'd be harder than her to convince. She does try to argue a little bit, but not enough if you ask me. Terrible people. No wonder she dates Ellie. Anyway, she helps him by reviving him, and this time Victor does get superpowers. And his power is to control the pain level in another person. So he can either make the pain go away or make it much stronger. And unfortunately, because when he comes back he doesn't know that, and he doesn't know straight away how to control it, he kills Angie in the process. So he calls Ellie, who doesn't seem to care all that much. He tells Victor to stay put and that he's coming over and that they'll figure it out. But really, Ellie is calling the police. Which is interesting. Ellie was practically shouting. Look, he was saying, just stay there. I don't know what you've done, but stay there. You hear me? Don't move. And Victor might have actually stayed put if he hadn't heard the double click. The landline in their apartment had been provided by the university. It made a faint double click when it was lifted from its spot on the wall. Now, as Ellie spoke to him on his cell and instructed him to stay put, and as Victor tried to get his coat on, he could just make out the small double click in the background. He frowned. A double click, followed by 3 tonal taps. 911. Don't move, Ellie said again. I'll be right there. And, I mean, yes, the police needed to be called. There is a dead body. But the way he did it is pretty douchey, let's be honest. Because, yeah, on one hand, there is a dead body, so the police does need to be involved. On the other hand, he also could have just not stabbed his friend in the back. Maybe listen when Victor says it was an accident, instead of, reporting him for murder immediately. Granted, we don't know what Ellie said to the police exactly, but considering that when they arrive, they arrest Victor on the spot, and they sent a trained force that is specialized in arresting EOs. Somehow I don't believe Ellie put in a good word for Victor. So I understand Victor being a little bit grumpy. But after that, Victor escapes the police. Some agent officer called Stell, who seems to be tracking down EOs specifically. And so Victor goes to find Ellie and stabs him repeatedly. He knows Ellie can't die, so it's just for funsies, you know. Ellie ends up shooting Victor though, and he nearly kills him. But he doesn't, and the police arrives and arrest Victor, and he ends up in prison for 10 years. And to be honest, they're both shit people, and it's kind of hard at this point to know who to root for. It seems at this stage that Victor is a little bit worse. But after that debacle, Ellie convinces himself that there is something deeply wrong with EOs and that something inside them dies as they come back to life after their near-death experience. But he also seems to think that he is the exception, that he hasn't lost a piece of himself in becoming an EO, and that he is on a mission from God to kill all other EOs. Some other people too, to cover up for the other murders. Skies wasn't an EO, no, but he was a loose end, and as Ellie's car drove over him with a thud, and that moment of quiet filled Ellie's chest, he knew he'd done the right thing. Ellie didn't enjoy killing. He did quite like the moment after. The glorious quiet that filled the air as his broken bones healed and his torn skin closed, and he knew that God approved. Yeah, that's what serial killers say. Let's now jump forward a few years and meet Sydney, a character who in present day hangs out with Victor, but let's not go quite that far yet. We see Sydney and her sister Serena fall into a frozen lake in winter and have a near-death experience which grants them superpowers. Sydney to resurrect the dead, and Serena to influence people. And we get the impression that Serena is not a great sister when she abandons Sydney at the hospital and influences her to stay there and not whine and moan about it. And after disappearing from Sydney's life for a while, Serena calls her someday to ask her to join her where she is so they can just kind of hang out together. Sydney is a bit annoyed, but she does end up joining her sister, and she is introduced to Serena's new boyfriend, a man called Ellie. Serena and Ellie take Sydney for a walk in the forest, and Ellie shoots her. Luckily, Sydney manages to escape, and she ends up on a road where she meets Victor and a guy he met in prison called Mitch, and they just decide to take her along. And because she's been shot, she's in pain, so Victor, whose power is that he can control the levels of pain in other people, just takes her pain away. They book a hotel room for the three of them, and at some point Victor learns about some guy, some EO that Ellie shot some time ago, pretty recently, while pretending to stop this guy from committing a robbery. Basically, Ellie staged a whole scene where this guy was pretending to rob a bank, and so it was all a setup for Ellie to kill him in broad daylight while pretending to be a hero. Which brings us to present day, where Sydney and Victor are in a cemetery trying to resurrect the guy who Ellie killed a few days ago to send him a message. There, nice and sweet. I tried to make the whole recap of what happened in the past as short as possible, but it's in no way does honor to what's in the book. With the whole structure being non-linear, it's just very satisfying how every reveal come in. And the way we just keep guessing what's next crazy thing is going to happen is just very cool. It's just a real joy to read. Anyway, this guy, Barry, they resurrect him and they send him to Ellie to tell him to watch out for Victor and Sydney because they are alive and they're looking for him. Which makes Ellie a little tense. So after that, they just kind of start dancing around each other and try to lure each other out. Also, not the most relevant to the plot, but at some point Victor and Sydney are just kind of walking around town and they come across a dying dog. And Victor takes its pain away. It was a dog. Victor knelt just long enough to run a finger down its back, and the whining faded. Now the only sounds it made were shuddering breath. At least it wouldn't be in pain. What? And after that, Sydney tells him to shoot the dog, which he does. He doesn't know at this point that she can bring back the dead. So I think, and I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt here, I think he assumes she just wants him to put the dog out of its misery. But I'm a little bit suspicious at how easy it was to convince him to kill a dog. Kill it. Victor arched an eyebrow. With what, Sid? She gave him a long, hard look. Please kill the dog, Victor, she said again. He looked around. The alley was empty. He sighed and pulled the handgun from its place against his back. Digging in his pocket, he retrieved the silencer and screwed it on, glancing over it at the wheezing dog. Scoot back, he said, and Sydney did. Victor took aim and pulled the trigger once. A clean shot. But anyway, Sydney brings the dog back to life and asks Victor if they can keep him. So they do, they keep him, and Victor names the dog Doll, which is a measure of pain, which in this context I find insanely cool. Where the hell did that dog come from? Asked Mitch. I get to keep him, said Sydney. Is that blood? I shot him, said Victor, searching through his papers. Why would you do that? Asked Mitch, closing the laptop. Because he was dying. Then why isn't he dead? Because Sydney brought him back. Mitch turned to consider the small blonde girl in the middle of the hotel living room. Excuse me? Her eyes went to the floor. Victor named him Doll, she said. It's a measurement of pain, explained Victor. Can we get back to the part where Sydney resurrected him? I love them so much. Mitch, who is Victor's former prison buddy, is also a hacker, and he manages to get access to Ellie's hit list. And on that hit list, Victor finds something very interesting. A man called Dominic who seems to be taking pain medication. So Victor thinks, I could offer him to take away his pain in exchange for his help. Which they do. They recruit him, and he is overjoyed when Victor takes his pain away. He could feel and see as the pain left Dominic's body. Watch it slide from his limbs and his jaw and his forehead and his eyes, which then widen in shock. And the whole scene where they recruit Dominic is actually very cool because it all happens in a bar, and Ellie is also in said bar trying to use Dominic as bait to attract Victor. Because he knows that Victor is also going to use Dominic as bait. And neither of them really wants to step out of the shadows, so they just keep dancing a bit around each other, and in this scene you just see them getting closer and closer, and the hype is building, and it's just completely insane. It's perfect. And there's even a moment where Victor spots Ellie from the back and Ellie doesn't see him. And I was just so hyped. He didn't see anything, but the dark-haired man caught Mitch's stride as he wove through the crowd, away from them and toward the front door, hand reaching out for the handle. Victor wondered how could he know that man without seeing his face. It was the posture, the broad shoulders and the arrogant way he held them, the edge of his sharp jaw visible as he turned away. Ellie. Victor's hand began to slip from Dominic's arm. Ellie Eva was right there, half a room away, his back turned, his attention derailed, and his body caught between seconds. I love Friends to Enemies. Also, Ellie shoots Mitch in the bathroom of the bar, which isn't that big a deal because Mitch came prepared wearing a bulletproof vest, but still. Is he... started Dominic, as Victor reached out and brought his fingertips to the gunshot hole in Mitch's jacket. His hand came away dry. He let out a breath and patted Mitch's jaw. The man groaned. Motherfucker. I see you met Ellie, said Victor. He's always been a bit trigger happy. Victor is freaking hilarious. So yeah, the good guys recruit Dominic. And his power is that he can basically walk through shadows, and so from the outside it kind of looks like he can teleport himself. In reality it's not quite that, but still very convenient. Anyway, through a method that I will not detail because time, this video is honestly long enough, Victor manages to send Ellie the message of where to find him for their final confrontation, in a building under construction where nobody will disturb them. Mitch finds Serena, and after another fake out where we are led to believe that Mitch died, Mitch and Victor manage to kill Serena. Meanwhile, back to Ellie. Due to some shenanigans with Serena before she died, Sydney finds herself alone with Ellie and Doll the dog before Victor gets there. Ellie tries to shoot her but kills the dog instead. Yeah, I may be slightly biased. Victor then arrives like a hero and asks Dominic to take Sydney away. They go, grabbing Doll's dead body with them, and after many efforts, Sydney actually manages to bring the poor dog back to life for a second time, which normally should not be possible because it's been established before in the story that you only get one extra chance. But Sydney is just awesome. I like dogs. And now we finally get the confrontation between Victor and Ellie. And it's awesome. Victor starts by shooting Ellie in the exact same way that Ellie shot him 10 years ago. And then he just completely mauls him. And it's just amazing. You can't kill me, Victor, said Ellie. You know that. Victor's smile widened as he buried his knife between Ellie's ribs. I know, he said loudly. He had to speak up over the screams. But you'll have to indulge me. I've waited so long to try. Victor is the best. I like good dialogue too. But ultimately, because Ellie heals, he ends up winning the fight. So he ties Victor to a chair and kills him. Listen, this is not an emotional response, okay? This is 100% fact. Dominic buckled. He went down on his hands and knees in an alley 4 blocks from the high-rise, a safe distance from the flood of cops and the burning girl and the guns. He cried out, and at the same time, Sydney clutched her arm, and Mitch rubbed at his bruised ribs. Pain swept over the three like a current, like a breath. Something held back and now returned. And then, one by one, they realized what that meant. I love that moment. Because what happens is basically Victor had taken all of their pain away at one point in the story, and so now that he's dead, they just get the pain back. And so when they feel the pain again, they just realize that it means that Victor is dead. It is so freaking gorgeous. I love it. I love it. I love it. And then the police arrives and they see Ellie with a dead body next to him. Ellie tries to argue that he was just doing his heroic duty, killing the bad guy, and it was self-defense, by the way. But considering Victor is tied to a chair and Ellie is unharmed, it's hard to argue self-defense. But as the blade hit the floor, the cops rushed forward and slammed him to the ground. He could see Victor's dead face from there, and it seemed to be smiling at him. Ellie Eva, you're under arrest for the murder of Victor Vale. Ellie, it's a pleasure to see you fall. So Ellie gets arrested. And of course, the last scene of the book is Mitch and Sydney going to the cemetery and resurrecting Victor. Gorgeous. And now let's talk about the characters. Let's start with Victor. Victor is a beautiful, beautiful bastard. He is so twisted, and it's just a delight to watch him evolve. The flashbacks of 10 years ago just kind of show how twisted he is, and it's very clear that he's not a good person. And for a while, I was just reading and waiting for the reveal that Ellie is just worse than him. And it really took a while. Like, for a while, he is really built up as kind of the villain. And it's just hard to imagine that Ellie could ever be worse. He just really feels like he is the one who started this whole thing. And yeah, for a while, you just don't see anything wrong that Ellie could have done. Especially when Angie dies and the only thing that Victor can think about is running away. Like, he just doesn't care, and then he just tries to find Ellie and stab him. His dynamic with Ellie is fabulous, of course, and there's the whole crescendo of them trying to find each other and just getting closer and closer and closer, and I was just on the edge of my seat. So hyped, so looking forward to the moment where they would actually have this confrontation. I just wanted them to meet so bad. And at first, they have a moment where they talk on the phone to each other, and already I was just like, ah! And then Victor sees him in a bar from a distance, and it's just... And then they finally meet, and it was just everything I was hoping for. His relationship with Sydney and Mitch is just absolutely precious. Proper found family. I want them to be brothers and sisters so bad. Like, book 2 should just be about them in a cabin in the wood being happy with Doll. I just love how Victor tries to be a good person around Sydney despite being generally an awful human being, and just how much he seems to care about her. Like, he's a horrible person and yet he still somehow wants to do good by her. Serena hadn't told Sydney to go home. She hadn't told her to run away. She'd told her to go somewhere safe. And over the course of the last week, safe had ceased to be a place for Sydney and had become a person. Specifically, safe had become Victor. I squealed. I did when I read that. And I was on the bus and I squealed. And it was ridiculous. Also, Victor is hilarious. Scene where they just kidnapped a guy. You said either one would do. Stell was out. I caught this one on a smoke break, said Mitch. Victor smiled beatifically as he turned his attention to the man in the chair. Smoking's bad for you, Officer Dane. Now let's talk about Ellie. Ellie is a terrible human being. And I loved him. And I'm glad he got owned in the end. It was such a pleasure to watch him lose. I felt like a sadist every second of the way. It was so interesting to see him look like such a genuine, decent guy in the flashbacks, only to see the mask fall little by little, and how it seems that only Victor could see just how twisted he was at first. Like, he's always described as this really charming guy, like almost politician-like. But Victor sensed that he had something a bit twisted about him. And that's kind of why they became friends in the first place. And I find it interesting that I can't really tell if Ellie ever really cared about Victor. He doesn't really seem to. He just really has a thing where he knows how to portray the right emotion, but he doesn't necessarily feel the emotion. He knows how he should feel in certain situations, and he's always kind of annoyed that he doesn't feel what he's supposed to. And it's hard to say if that's something that came from his becoming an EO, because it is mentioned that they do have a part of them that dies when they become an EO. And I don't think we get his point of view before he becomes an EO, but you do get this idea after, and this sense after, that he wishes he could feel what he's supposed to feel, but he doesn't. So I don't know if that's a new development after he becomes an EO, or if it was always like this. But for example, when he learns that Angie dies, it's kind of explained that he's trying to feel grief, but he doesn't really. He just knows he should. So yeah, interesting character. I'm really curious what's gonna happen to him in book 2. Now let's talk about Sydney. Sydney is a sweetheart. I love her. She's great. I don't have much to say about her because she's just great. She's very sweet, and her relationship with Serena made me very sorry for her. You can tell that she really, really loves her older sister, and Serena, she does seem to love her too, but probably not as much. It feels like she always kind of keeps her at arm's length. Probably because with their parents not giving them enough attention and not really treating them right, Sydney ended up turning a bit too much towards Serena for support, which I think Serena finds a bit too much to handle, which in a way is fair, but it's also heartbreaking. At the end of the book, it also seems that Sydney doesn't know that Mitch and Victor are the ones who ended up killing Serena, so I'm very, very curious to see where that goes. I hope it's not gonna drive a wedge between them at some point. I just love her relationship with Victor and how he just kind of somehow becomes her older brother. How she just somehow manages to see the good in him even though nobody else does. I hope Victor hurts him, she said cheerfully. A lot. Jesus. 3 days and you're already taking after him. Mitch sagged into a chair, ran his hand over his shaved head. Look, Sydney, there's something you need to understand about Victor. He's not a bad man, she said. There are no good men in this game, said Mitch. But Sydney didn't care about good. She wasn't sure she believed in it. I'm not afraid of Victor. I know. He sounded sad when he said it. So now let's talk about Mitch. Mitch is probably the closest to a good person that this book has to offer, and I honestly love him for it. I mean, Sydney is too, but let's be honest, there's something just a little bit off about her. Like, I'm sorry, but she thinks Victor is a good person. And I don't know, Mitch is just an absolute sweetheart, and I loved him to bits. I love that he's like this big thug looking guy, and he's actually arrested for being a hacker. Hacking, he said cheerfully. Sydney laughed. Seriously? I had you pegged as more of a beat someone to death with their own arm type. I've always been big, said Mitch. That's not my fault. That was fun. Hadn't seen that coming. He's just also very kind. For a while I was kind of confused what such a good person was doing with someone like Victor. But it seems like it's because Victor manages to see past his appearance, which is something that not a lot of people manage to do. So I can imagine Mitch appreciating that. A lot of people see him and just assume that he's violent and dangerous, and that's caused him a lot of harm in his life. And it just got him into troubles many, many times. And he actually ended up becoming a criminal because he thought well, if I'm gonna be accused of a crime, I might as well commit a crime. Which is a logic. And now let's talk about Serena. I hated Serena for many reasons. First, the way she behaved towards Sydney, of course. I like Sydney, so I'm biased. And, you know, technically, Serena is Sydney's older sister, and she has no responsibility to look after Sydney to make up for their parents' bad parenting. But there's just something about how much she catered to Sydney's adoration towards her, while knowing that she would never give her what Sydney expects of her. That just was a bit frustrating to me. There was just this way that she was always telling Sydney that she would be there for her while having no intention to do so. That always felt really wrong. And then there's the whole thing with her power that makes her particularly twisted as well. She can basically influence anyone to do whatever she wants, which is, you know, super convenient. And at some point you get her perspective and she's just like, oh, it's so hard to have everyone do what you want. I wish someone would, like, resist my commands. But then you see her just kind of controlling people and using her powers to toy with them like she's just having the time of her life. Her relationship with Ellie was very messed up too, because for some reason he manages to kind of resist her command once in a while for a little bit. And so she just likes to, like, toy with him and see how far he can push it. It was very much like cat and mouse kind of feeling, and she just seems to delight in it a bit too much, which just got very uncomfortable very fast. And that's already it for the characters, because I'm trying to get these a bit shorter. But honestly, I'm so super hyped to read Vengeful. I'm just very curious to see where it all goes from there, because at this point, I don't know, it feels a bit like a closed case. Ellie is in prison and Victor gets resurrected and he lives happily ever after with Mitch and Sydney and the dog. Or should I say, forever? But yeah, what messed up things can happen to trigger a whole other book? What mess are they gonna get dragged into? Anyway, that's it for Vicious. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you want to see more of my face. Thanks for tuning in, and continue to enjoy stories.